Hi guys. So these hiatuses of mine becoming quite the habit, aren't they? Sorry for my absence again. Truth is, I've actually been working a lot, which is great for my bank account. Not so good for my YouTube account. In any case, there's always something. There's always something that draws me right back in. Some new challenge, no matter how busy or lazy I get. Remember Noah of Veritas48 fame? Back in the day, he and I butted heads quite a bit. During his time on YouTube, he was probably, I think, the Christian apologist most respected by both the believing and non-believing communities alike. And he hasn't posted in about a year or two now, in part because his channel got hacked. All of his videos got taken down. But I think it was around that time that he realized his heart just wasn't in it anymore. But there is life after YouTube apologetics, apparently. And since then, he and I have actually become pretty close friends. He moved out to California, where I live. I've gotten to see him a couple times in person. We talk on the phone a lot. Anyway, one day recently, he and I were shooting the shit, reminiscing about the good old. I feel like I'm name dropping right now. Like I'm gonna be cooler if I hang out with Veritas. Anyway, the subject of his old videos came up, and I should say, by the way, Noah's views now are not the same as they once were. And although it's not my place to tell you why they changed or how they've changed or to what degree, I think a survey of his old YouTube videos would be a pretty poor reflection of where he stands philosophically today. But in light of this, I thought it'd be really interesting to know which of his old apologetic videos he's most proud of in hindsight. And to my surprise, it turned out that one of them was his response to my video on the argument from non-belief. And it was a solid response, but it was, I think, like the only video he ever did that was addressed to me that I just never replied to, ever. And so, just for fun, I want to do that now. Partly because I think Noah will get a kick out of it, but also because even though Noah's words that I'll be quoting in this video don't necessarily reflect his views anymore, they do strongly represent the sort of canonized Christian answer to the problem of non-belief. Noah spoke rather articulately, I think, for an entire community of people in that video, and I think it's important to address these counterpoints, whether they had come from Noah or not. So throughout this video, I want you to think of Noah's words as more of a model for Christian apologetics in general. And for the record, if you want to be comprehensively caught up for this video, you'll see links in the description box to both my argument and Noah's response, which he has graciously re-uploaded to Vimeo. So let's get started. Okay, so let's parse out some terminology and key concepts before I really get to the meat of the argument. At 1 minute and 10 seconds, Noah objected to my contention that the Christian God hasn't made the facts relevant to our salvation clear or apparent to the world. He says this is merely an assumption on my part based on the observation that many people in the world don't believe in God, and that the existence of non-believers really only means that these people are unconvinced, not that God hasn't made the relevant facts clear or apparent. But, you know, tomato, tomato. When I say that God hasn't made these facts clear or apparent, what I mean is that not everyone in the world finds them to be so. Clarity and apparentness, in my mind, are words that describe the relationship of people to propositions, not the truthhood or evidence of these propositions in and of themselves. In other words, Noah and I are saying the same thing. When I say that God has not made these facts clear or apparent, I am saying that many people in the world are not convinced of their truth. They are one and the same problem. At 1 minute and 40, Noah said, quote, "It's as if Scott would have us believe that everyone would suddenly stop and have a relationship with the Lord if he made A through D patently clear to everybody," end quote. A through D are facts known relevant to our salvation. But that's not what I'd have you believe at all. In fact, my argument quite explicitly relies on the notion that even if the relevant facts seemed obviously true to everyone in the world, we'd still have the freedom to reject God's offer of salvation. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Noah objects to my first premise by arguing that it falsely assumes that propositional knowledge is God's primary concern. Rather, it's filial knowledge that God is after. By the way, filial refers to the personal relationship of a child to a parent type figure. I had to look that up. Anyway, again, this is another mischaracterization of my argument because no such assumption need be made. I mean, even granting that filial knowledge, not just propositional knowledge of God's existence, is his primary concern, there's no escaping the fact that the latter is a necessary prerequisite for the former. Propositional knowledge of God's existence or other facts relevant to salvation needn't be God's primary goal in order for them to be goals necessarily entailed by it. Teeny tiny digression, however. An apologist may want to counter this by making some distinction between belief and knowledge. They may say that propositional knowledge of the relevant facts are not necessary for a filial relationship with God, only propositional belief. In other words, it could be argued that we don't need unequivocal knowledge of God's existence in order to be saved. We need only believe in God's existence. Okay, well, this is true. It's only true trivially. If it is the case that belief in God, not knowledge, is necessary for salvation, then consider my argument modified accordingly. And in fact, I contend that the two are indistinguishable, at least from the finite vantage point of the subject. Knowledge is just a word we use to describe the concept of a belief that's actually true. And since I'm assuming God's existence for the sake of argument here, I use the word knowledge. Further, if you want to throw in a little neuroscience, belief and knowledge are indistinguishable at the level of a subject's brain. I mean, you ask somebody a question to which the answer is considered known, such as, does 2 + 2 = 4, or are pigs mammals? And the kind of neural activity that's going to take place upon answering will be the same as if you were to ask a belief question, like, do angels watch over us, or do animals go to heaven? In any case, Noah anticipated my response when he said, quote, but the atheist could retort that in order to have filial knowledge of God, one must actually believe that God exists, end quote. And at 3 minutes 25 seconds, Noah expressed that he sees, quote, no reason to believe that God providing more evidence of his existence would lead to more people coming into a relationship with him, end quote. But such reasons do exist. And I think Noah simply isn't looking hard enough for them, or at least he wasn't at the time. But let me be clear from the start that I am not merely after more evidence, as Noah implies. Different people have different ideas about what constitutes evidence. Rather, I'm cutting to the chase, and I'm arguing that we should reasonably expect to see more belief, the maximization of people in the world who are convinced that God exists and that he has provided a plan of salvation. But like I said, Noah claimed to see no reason for thinking that this would give rise to more saved people in the world than we observe today. I disagree. First and foremost, the personal testimony of presumably saved Christians affirms this. I mean, ask yourself how often you hear a pastor, evangelist, apologist, or born-again churchgoer claim to enjoy salvation and a loving relationship with God, albeit without ever having become convinced at any point that God actually exists or that Christianity is actually true. I mean, if such a person exists, I've never met them. Time and time again, we hear the personal testimony of once non-believing Christians who became saved only after becoming convinced that Christianity, as a proposition, is true, either by what they perceive to be overwhelming evidence or a sudden personal interaction with God himself or some other reason. Whatever way you slice it, almost anyone you run into who converted from non-belief to Christianity did so because they became convinced, somehow, some way, that Christianity was in fact a true account of reality. I mean, the idea that more people would become saved if more people believed that Christianity was true is so intuitive that you have to work really hard to deny that. I mean, you have to resort to some serious ad hoc speculation. Take, for instance, Noah's reason for objecting to this. Quote, providing the entire world with propositional knowledge of God's existence may in fact be deleterious to filial knowledge. It may be deleterious to having a relationship with God. And he goes on to say, there are lots of examples within the Judeo-Christian tradition where God being transparent in his existence is actually met with hardened hearts from people. Read the story of Israel being led out of Egypt. Despite the fact that Israel had clear knowledge of God's existence, they constantly lacked the sort of relationship God had wanted. End quote. Well, there's a problem with this sort of inference, namely that Noah is positing causality when he has no justification for it. I mean, it is not the case that Israel had the kind of loving, obedient relationship with God that he wanted up until God made his existence explicitly clear to them. I mean, the Old Testament documents God's history of frustration with his chosen people, or fabricates it, take your pick. And this dated long before Moses was ever commissioned to lead them out of Egypt. So the conclusion that newfound belief in God's existence is deleterious to a loving relationship with him doesn't follow, at least not from this example. In fact, The sort of rebellion against God, despite certainty of his existence that we find in the Old Testament, is not a point for Noah's case, but for my own. I mean, this clearly nullifies any objection that belief in God's existence negates the freedom of human beings to reject God and salvation or to make morally significant decisions. Finally, I think we should all find it suspect that Noah's best attempt to support this objection, or his best attempt at the time, was to ignore the modern-day observable world in favor of unverifiable anecdotes from the Holy Book whose very truth is in question here. I mean, why didn't Noah take this opportunity, this perfect opportunity, to point out people in the world today, people we know or know of, who used to have the kind of loving filial relationship with God that he desires, all the way up until they became overwhelmingly convinced that God really does exist and that Christianity really is true? Well, I suspect it's because we would all be hard-pressed to find such an example. Suppose long ago I fathered a child who does not presently know I exist. Due to her mother's discretion, my child believes that her father died before she was ever born, or something like that. Now suppose that I want my child to develop a filial relationship with me. What would be necessary for this desire to be realized? I mean, is it possible for my daughter to cultivate such a relationship without her believing in my existence or paternity? Well, clearly not. But more importantly, is there any conceivable way that her belief in my existence and paternity could be more deleterious to the possibility of a filial relationship with me than having no such belief? I mean, if there is, I can't see it. Anyway, Noah continued, quote, though TBS may quote 1 Timothy 2:4, God wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, he forgets James 2:19, which says, you believe there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that. End quote. But Noah was wrong. I hadn't forgotten James 2:19. I just knew that it does nothing to invalidate my argument. The author isn't claiming that a belief in God is bad for us or that God doesn't want us to know the truth. In fact, he describes this belief as good. The passage only illustrates the point that belief in God alone isn't sufficient for salvation. Not only don't I deny this, it's integral to my argument because it leaves room for someone to be convinced that Christian doctrines are true while retaining the freedom to not become saved, which is apparently a high priority for God in Christian theology. So I don't know why Noah would invoke James 2:19, since it isn't a point against my argument, nor does it make sense as a rebuttal to the verse I cited in 1 Timothy. Noah never addressed this. He only attempted to shift the focus toward a different verse instead. But we still have here Christian scripture explicitly telling us that God wants for every person to know the truth. All of this is to say, we do have good reasons for supposing that if more people believed Christianity was true, then more people would become saved, whereas we do not, so far, have good reasons for supposing the opposite, that if more people believed Christianity was true, fewer people would become saved. I can imagine one last-ditch effort to escape this problem. It's highly disingenuous. It's clearly an ad hoc attempt to save Christianity at all costs, but it is a way out, and it goes like this. Ready? For every person in the world who has or will die unconvinced that Christianity is true, that person would not have chosen to become saved even if they were convinced that Christianity is true, and God knows this. Now, this would either be the most astounding coincidence of all time, or it's more or less Calvinism, predestination, the idea that God chooses beforehand who will be saved and who won't. And I freely admit, Calvinism has immunity from my argument. It has immunity from the problem of non-belief. Of course, I would make a different argument against Calvinism, namely that God is flat out evil, but that's another video. But as long as you concede that there exist non-believers in the world who will die non-believers that would have chosen salvation if they had become convinced that Christianity is true, then the problem still stands, and so does my argument. So now let's examine Noah's objection to my second premise, which said that God has the power to make each of us know or believe the relevant facts pertaining to our salvation. Noah said at 6 minutes and 21 seconds, quote, my primary concern with premise 2 is that it leads to a contradiction. Scott is saying that God has the power to make us know we are sinners, but knowing one is a sinner is in all actuality a choice that we freely make, end quote. Now, right off the bat, I don't see how this follows at all, because free will does not grant us the power to choose what we are and are not convinced is true, only the power to choose our actions based on that information. Let's try an experiment. If I asked you to become convinced at this very moment, to genuinely begin believing that Santa Claus exists and visits every home in the world on Christmas Eve with a sled led by 8 flying reindeer, could you do it? No, of course not. Does this mean you have no free will? No, of course not. If the Christian God exists and has issued moral prescriptions that you haven't perfectly fulfilled, that's all being a sinner means in Christian theology. Even if you believe this is the case, you can still choose not to do anything about it. You can still choose to keep on sinning. You can refuse God's gift of salvation from the consequences of these sins, but you can't freely decide whether or not to be convinced that this proposition is true. That's not what the concept of free will is all about. I mean, if you're watching this video right now, I've already forced you to know certain things, to believe certain things. You now believe that at some point I sat down and recorded myself speaking this very sentence. You have no freedom to choose whether or not you are convinced that I spoke this sentence. If you believe I did speak the words I'm speaking, you may have the freedom to pretend that you don't or to behave as if you don't, but you don't have the power to decide to become genuinely convinced that I didn't speak these words. And the fact that you have no such power does not negate the freedom of choice we're talking about, which pertains to our actions, the things we do in response to the propositions we believe. So, on its face, this criticism from Noah seems silly and obviously false, but Noah went on to present an analogy which may give us better insight into at least the thought process that led him to that conclusion. He said, quote, "It's like admitting you're an alcoholic. A dozen family members can surprise you, lock you in a room with them, and literally do everything short of forcing you to see that you're an alcoholic, but ultimately it's up to you to come to believe that you're an alcoholic. Other people cannot make you know this. It's a decision that you make freely," end quote. Okay, now it's coming together. Here Noah made a false analogy because he confused objective facts and our belief in them with our decisions about what to do given those beliefs. Now forget the subjective judgment word alcoholic. If I knowingly suck down 5 handles of Jack Daniels in a day, I do not have the freedom to become unconvinced that I drink this much. I don't even have the freedom to decide whether or not I'm convinced this is a problem, i.e. that it actually constitutes alcoholism. Belief is an involuntary reaction. Either I am convinced or I'm not. What I do have the freedom to decide is my course of action based on this information. And I think this is what Noah was really getting at. Or at least I hope it was, because his objection didn't make any sense otherwise. Becoming convinced that I'm an alcoholic does not negate my free decision about what to do next. I can keep drinking myself to death, or I can quit cold turkey, or I can seek help. Likewise, becoming convinced that I'm a sinner, that God exists and that I've broken his commands, does not negate my free decision about what to do next. I can fall to my knees and ask for forgiveness, or I can go out and find a brothel. Okay, at the 7-minute mark, Noah says, quote, "Recognizing and coming to the knowledge that you're a sinner is a willful decision in which one looks inward and takes inventory of one's own moral life," end quote. Okay, so when Noah uses the phrase recognize you're a sinner or come to know that you're a sinner, what he's really referring to is something we do. It's when we make the conscious decision to reassess our moral decision making. That's an action. That's something we do. Noah is not merely describing the experience of becoming convinced that a certain proposition is true, which is what my second premise was all about. Merely becoming convinced that God exists and that I've fallen short of his moral commands does not necessarily entail that I will make the conscious decision to, as Noah puts it, look inward and take inventory of my moral life. The latter is not a belief. It's a course of action. My second premise was very simple, that the Christian God would have the ability to convince us that certain propositions are true, not that the Christian God would have the ability to make us choose a course of action. Well, I'm sure the Christian God would have that ability, but my argument doesn't entail him exercising it. In any case, Noah's objection to my second premise missed the mark, and as I explained, I think this is because he mistakenly conflated courses of action, which we can freely choose, with genuine belief, which we never freely choose. Okay, now, at 7 minutes and 25 seconds, Noah really began to bottom line his rebuttal to my entire argument. And here it is, quote, All any theist would have to do to defeat Scott's argument is find a single possible explanation as to why God would allow for non-belief and remain hidden, even when the potential threat of hell and our eternal security are at stake. End quote. Now, shockingly, I agree with this. I mean, that is all an apologist would have to do. Essentially, they'd have to find a possible reason that God could have for leaving so many people unconvinced of his existence, given this particular plan of salvation and his professed desires for humanity. Of course, the question is, what constitutes a possible reason? Let's put it this way. What would make a reason impossible for God to have? Well, it would be impossible for God to have an irrational reason, right? Because God would be perfectly rational. It would be impossible for God to have a reason based on, say, a false assumption or a fallacious inference. And as it happens, I'm about to argue that this is exactly the sort of reason Noah went on to provide. Quote, "It could very well be the case that if God made his existence completely apparent to everybody, this would in effect take away our freedom to make morally significant decisions, none the least of which includes responding to what self-revelation he's given." Noah goes on to say, "God remains purposefully hidden in order to give people the necessary space to either respond to him or avoid him and keep their autonomy from him. See, if God made himself completely apparent to everybody in the way Scott is demanding, especially given his message of judgment, people would subsequently respond to him out of self-preservation, which is not what God wants in Christian theology." End quote. Okay, so the reason Noah put forth here is loaded with assumptions. Not necessarily bad assumptions, but assumptions nonetheless, and I want to go through and kind of explicate some of them before I respond. The first and most important of which, I think, is this caricature that Noah paints of my argument. Now keep in mind, all I'm doing is making predictions about the very least we should reasonably expect to see if the God of Christianity exists. But notice that Noah smuggled in phrasing like, "in the way Scott demands." And it makes me wonder what exactly this way is that Noah thought I was prescribing. Because in actuality, the way God goes about this is totally irrelevant. And yet, Noah gave the impression that my argument requires God to manifest in some physical, tangible form, readily apprehensible to all of us by our senses, looming over all of our shoulders when we make moral decisions, saying, "You're not going to have sex with her, are you? Because that would be a sin. You don't want to go to hell, do you?" You know, that would be a very extreme way for God to ensure that each person is convinced he exists. But the conclusion of my argument doesn't necessitate anything even close to this. What I'm after here is neither a different degree nor a different quality of belief than we already see from Christians all over the world today. Just keep in mind that I'm not prescribing any particular mechanism. I'm not demanding any particular mechanism. I'm only arguing that if Christianity is true, we should reasonably expect to see a state of affairs caused by God in which each person, regardless of reason, is convinced that the facts relevant to their salvation are true. That's it. Now, as an aside, I do want to talk a little bit about this kind of silly projection that takes place so often in Christian apologetics. This idea that I'm actually demanding something from God, despite the fact that I don't even believe he exists. I mean, that I couldn't possibly be making a dispassionate inference based on the qualities, desires, and prior actions Christianity attributes to God. No. It has to be personal and emotional in nature. It can only be that I don't like the way that God does things, so I refuse to believe in him. Now, I'm skipping around now, but Noah even closed his video at 14 minutes, 25 seconds with the following charge. Quote, "This argument is incredibly presumptuous. It's just another way of saying if the Christian God were real, he would do such and such. I think what this argument is really saying is, if I were God, I would do such and such, but God doesn't do such and such, and so God must not be real." End quote. I mean, this is borderline insulting. But it was by no means original to Noah. Trust me, I've heard this apologetic soundbite so many times I can't even tell you, and I'm sure Noah had too. But, you know, after a moment's reflection, which I'm sure Noah has since afforded himself, this is really just a double standard at work. If theologians draw inferences about God's motives and plans and methods for a living. Nobody accuses them of making demands of God or coming to a conclusion just because it's what they would do if they were God. And yet here I am doing the exact same thing, only in reverse, because a theologian says, if that is true of the world, then this must be true of God. Well, I'm saying if that is true of God, then this must be true of the world. The only difference, really, is that the latter sort of inference can actually be verified or falsified. Theologian won't touch that with a 10-foot pole, especially with God's existence on the line. But I will. I'm happy to, no matter how many times it elicits this sort of how dare you style ad hominem attack. Okay, just had to get that off my chest. Sorry. Now we're back. Let's look at some of the other assumptions behind Noah's reasoning. He said that God, quote, remains purposefully hidden in order to give people the necessary space to either respond to him or avoid him and keep their autonomy, end quote. Now this statement already assumes several things. One is that without this space, as Noah called it, we would not have the ability to either respond to him or avoid him. This is because of the word necessary. The space is necessary for us to make this choice. Well, this is a very tangible claim. It's either true or it's not. But in order to make that appraisal, we need to know what exactly is meant by space. And since all I'm talking about in my argument, all I'm predicting is that each person would be convinced one way or another that certain propositions are true, the only thing space can mean is an absence of belief, an absence of being convinced that Christianity is true. Of course, that makes Noah's contention here absurd. What Noah meant here, or I should say the only thing Noah could have meant that would make sense as an objection to my argument, is that God remains hidden because in order for us to freely choose whether or not to become saved, it's necessary for us to be unconvinced that Christianity is true. And this is clearly false. I've never even met a Christian who doesn't claim to believe that Christianity is true, who isn't convinced for some reason that Christianity is true. For any person who claims to have experienced God's existence directly, would we say that their ability to freely reject God has been negated? Has their autonomy been squashed? Of course not. And if it were, why is God doing this to these poor people? Conversely, we have plenty of examples, biblical and otherwise, of sentient beings choosing to reject God and a relationship with him and his offer of salvation, despite being convinced that God actually exists and has made such an offer. Even the verse Noah cited in James demonstrates this. Demons themselves are convinced that Christianity is true. Nay, they have certainty that it's true. And still they reject a loving relationship with God. Well, let's flesh this out a little further. Noah said, quote, if God made himself completely apparent to everybody in the waste, God is demanding, there's that word again, especially given his message of judgment, people would subsequently respond to him out of self-preservation, which is not what God wants in Christian theology, end quote. Well, this is a clear non sequitur. By this logic, any Christian who has ever laid eyes on the Bible and believed what they read is likely to be responding to God only out of self-preservation. And yet, how can this be when God presumably wants every person to read the Bible and come away convinced of its truth? It follows that this cannot be God's reason. If the Christian God wanted us to remain unconvinced of his existence because he's concerned that the belief in his eventual judgment will contaminate our moral decision-making with prospects of punishment and reward, then his chosen means of revelation, the Bible, would not be littered with promises of punishment and reward. And yet it is. And speaking of the Bible, God is already purported to have had a long, thorough history of coercing human beings into changing their minds or behavior. Miracles, threats, bribes, favors, personal appearances, gifts, ultimatums, and so on. The biblical God has no problem with this kind of thing. So to paint God as someone who would put this much stock in preventing our moral decisions from being not even determined, but influenced, is to fabricate a patently unbiblical version of God. So in the end, I think Noah did not present us with a possible reason for the Christian God to leave us unconvinced of his existence. This is because the reason Noah did provide was predicated upon a falsehood that no perfectly rational, all-knowing being could possibly believe. And as such, the argument from non-belief, as I presented it, remains unrefuted. However, because there's always a however, this is not to say that I didn't learn something very valuable from Noah's response. In the meantime, it's become clear to me that treating the problem of non-belief as a rigorous logical proof rather than an inference to the best explanation is counterproductive. The problem with a logical proof is that you could always rationalize dismissing the argument as inconclusive simply by appealing to some mysterious, unknowable reason that could exist for why we observe what we do. I mean, respectably, this is not what Noah did. He attempted to offer up a specific reason, but even though he was unsuccessful, even though we can keep playing this game where the Christian tries to come up with a reason and I show why it isn't possible, they come up with another one, I show why that isn't possible, I still can't use logic to prove that there can exist no such reason in principle. We would just have to go case by case. And although I contend that I'll always be able to invalidate any reason an apologist could come up with, either because of Christian doctrine or real-world facts, I now believe that that's an exercise in counterproductivity because it distracts us from the most impactful thing about this problem, Namely, that the longer we play the game, the sillier and more absurd the reasons become, even if I couldn't show them to be logically impossible. I mean, it would take so much intellectual contouring, so many displays of theological gymnastics and extraneous ad hoc assumptions and unjustified speculation just to save Christianity from this predicament at all costs, that all you're left with is this weird labyrinth of unnecessarily overcomplicated backwards thinking. And yet, the problem evaporates with such simple, elegant parsimony when we begin to consider that this version of God never existed in the first place. And this is where I believe the problem of non-belief becomes truly profound. Okay, thanks for listening.